Hello, welcome to Reaction Norm, where we cover all the phenotypes, which is going to be a relevant consideration today. So my name is Michael McConkey, and I'm joined, as always, by my lovely and charming co-host, Patricia Vino. How you doing, Patricia?
Hi, Michael. I'm really well, thank you.
So today we're talking about this discussion between Richard Dawkins and Brett Weinstein that took place last week. So we're a little behind. We actually are this. We intend to go every week at some point, but for now we're doing every second week. So we're a little late on this, and other people have actually done some analyses of this discussion. But we thought we should do one because the premise of our show is kind of called into question if one were to take Richard Dawkins' side of this discussion. So,
Episode 3, and we're already having an existential crisis.
That's right. So
we're not actually having an existential crisis, but
no, but it does seem appropriate to address this. And I think it's besides the threat to our own existential purpose, I do think that it was an interesting discussion.
Absolutely.
And if this had been, I think some people misunderstood this, including a friend of ours. You probably know who I'm thinking of. I think misunderstood the significance of this because it wasn't necessarily a discussion about evolutionary biology, strictly speaking, and the importance of it wasn't the depth into which they went into the topics. Because if this had been, say, Bob Trivers and I don't know, Diana Fleshman or somebody having this conversation, then that would be a different kind of setting for the purpose of the discussion. Because it was Dawkins and Weinstein, it can be seen as, I think, kind of a meeting and perhaps confrontation between, on the one hand, the new atheists for whom Dawkins is, a major figurehead, and these intellectual dark web types for whom Brett Weinstein is a major figure. And so these were the two groups that came together. And I think both these groups would claim that they are scientifically serious, but they aren't necessarily well versed in biology. So I think it was interesting that they were having this discussion about biology. And the subtext, which became actually part of the discussion eventually, for how does what are the implications of our understanding of sort of the biological nature of human beings? What is its implication for thinking about society and history and these kind of things, right? That's the way I thought of it. I don't know what
yeah,
preparatory.
That was really well put. I think, yeah, exactly that. You nailed it. And they were very, very careful with the way that they sort of stated everything, and to talk about I would say that they actually never really got into anything. They definitely danced around a lot of interesting questions like that we'll be talking about on this show, hopefully, about, what might be sort of the uglier side of human biology.
Yeah. So, and in fact, there was the applause. There wasn't a lot of sort of spontaneous applause, but the few times where it happens, I thought it was quite telling. And maybe we'll come across a couple of those. So my suggestion is to I got my notes here. I'll be referring to occasionally, folks. Just hang in there. So my suggestion was to break it down this way. First, I want to talk about Dawkins' perspective on all of this, particularly where he seemed to me to be claiming a kind of dualism between the proper sphere of biology and the proper sphere of human life, society, history. Then I want to look at Weinstein's response to that, which I thought in some ways was quite correct. And yet he too, weirdly, even in arguing against Dawkins' dualism, kind of snuck in the back door his own dualism, kind of a separation between the sort of true self or something,
right,
as opposed to our nature, And then we were not sure if we're going to talk about the memes. There's a whole part at the end about memes, and we'll sort of see how that goes.
Right.
So do you so what I was going to do, I was going to play a few clips from each of them and give a flavor. Give people watching a flavor of what they said. Do you want anything you want to say prefatory to that?
No, let's dive in.
All right. So now I have to do this whole screen share thing. Let's see how this goes. All right.
Understand what history really is, and it actually lends a great deal of power to your point about the need to rebel. Let's look
Very
at
much so, yes.
the Second World War.
Yes.
Right? Even the terminology. You had the fatherland effectively raping Mother Russia. I mean, right? So what this was a lineage level phenomenon in which a population went after two other populations, one that was internal to its borders or its near neighbors, and one population that was distant but had a great many resources. But the point is, understood from the perspective of German genes, vile as these behaviors were, they were completely comprehensible from the level of fitness.
Or to couch this kind of explanation in Darwinian terms. So Darwinian evolution is about the natural selection of replicators. And the primary replicators we're talking about are genes. The vast majority of biological evolution, and you've been advocating the priority of this, genetic selection, producing bodies and brains the way they are. And now we come on to things like nationalism, things like individuals sacrificing themselves for the sake of the long-term future of their lineage, their society, their nation. This is not Darwinism. This is something else. This is a complicated mixture of human-level affairs, which historians deal with, sociologists deal with, psychologists deal with. This is not Darwinism. It's not helpful to.
You note the hopeful applause there, right?
Yeah.
Okay, but suppose you take the example of the Nazi invasion of the lands to the east, which you did before. You've got a nation taking a decision, which is,
and this is actually this is actually a slightly different part of his argument, but I thought I'd stick this in here too.
Right.
This is where he's not so much where he's saying you got to separate the two, but he's saying it's too complicated to try and provide a biological explanation because there's so many different fitness motives in play. So let's just hear what he had to say here.
It's a complicated matter of a state taking a decision to invade another state using modern weapons and using the weapons of diplomacy to argue the case in international courts and so on. And then you've got the individual soldiers going out there and killing people. And the psychological motives of the individual soldiers are going to be so different from those. I mean, they're not the ones who are actually taking the decision to go and invade Poland. They are doing quite different things. They're obeying their officers. They're perhaps giving vent to revenge motives because their comrade was killed in a previous battle or something of that sort. These are very, very complicated mixtures of motives, psychological motives, and.
Okay, so that wasn't absolutely beautiful, but
It should. If you haven't listened to the debate, you'll definitely get the idea of what the arguments were from that.
So I mean, just to try and give it then a brief summary, it's complicated with the commercials, obviously, but so the gist of it is I took it, and you can you intervene where you want and add or correct. So he's saying like we don't want to apply the the logic of biology when we're looking at human society and history. And there are like two main reasons I thought that he gave. On the one hand, is that, well, biology is just about replicators, like, evolution particularly is just about replicators, right? So we're not interested in, all this other stuff doesn't operate on that plane. So we shouldn't be applying that to this inappropriate domain of biology, right?
Right.
And the other argument there is that towards the end is that in any ways, even if you said everything has to be explained in terms of fitness interests, there's so many conflicting interests at work that, how can you can't say like there's, a nation doesn't go to war because of some biological imperative, because all the different individuals involved have actually different personal, individual or lineage fitness imperatives, right?
Right.
So that seemed to me the gist of it. Does that seem more or less what it was seemed to you?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, so now let's respond. What do you have to say?
Well, I mean, it's just hearkening back to some sort of dualism that I was surprised to hear either of these gentlemen use. I think that we're expecting an approach that was, grounded in materialism, and the idea of stepping out of your biology sort of implies that you're stepping somewhere else. And I don't know where else that is. And just because you can be aware of something doesn't mean that, it's still not part of your nature or that anything's changed. You're just aware of it now. So I thought that a lot of their language was very interesting, that seemed to be stepping away from biology or, rising above your biology, or sort of not being a slave to it. But I don't understand then where you're existing or, you know what I mean? Like, I don't understand, like, if it's grounded in science, like, what else is there? And for the discussion of, you can have discussions about what else is there, but it's not a scientific discussion.
That's right. Yeah. The sort of undercurrent irony here would be a lot of the theists over the years who have debated Richard Dawkins could be sitting here watching this saying, yes, well, Richard, there is an argument to say that you shouldn't reduce everything to biology.
Exactly.
I'm not sure you're making it,
Exactly.
Right. So yeah, for sure. And some of what you said there actually will apply to Weinstein when we get to him. On Dawkins particularly, I guess there's two thoughts that strike me as I watch those clips and remember this and recall the discussion. One is that first on this argument. Okay, let me just backtrack. I just don't understand. Other than the argument that he gave, which I'm going to address in a second. Other than that, I don't understand how he can claim that the function of replicators is not manifesting itself in human society and history. Because isn't that the whole point of the extended phenotype? Isn't that the whole point of the argument of the extended phenotype, is that these replicators have this effect that stretch out and affect the whole world? That's the whole point of the argument. So I just it seems weirdly some kind of weird compartmentalization or disassociation that he's engaging in there. But just going to this argument about how, even if you take seriously the idea that we're all motivated, by our genetic or fitness interests, this argument that somehow, well, you can't explain war because there's all these conflicting interests. I don't. Well,
it seemed like they were afraid of getting some little sound bite that made it seem like that war was, a good thing, or they supported war, or even that it was kind of an inevitable thing. And so I understand why they were trying to avoid, getting some sound bite taken out of context. But that doesn't mean that you can just dismiss everything that you don't like. Obviously, some people might like war, but I think we could agree the average person does not view this as a positive thing going on in humanity. But that doesn't mean that you can't talk about why it clearly benefits some agendas, right?
Yeah, it benefits some agendas, and even those who don't necessarily benefit from it can still be motivated out of fitness interests to take actions that contribute to it. Right. So right. The soldiers, like he talks about the soldiers, who are just following their commanding officers or whatever, and probably it takes more than that to be motivated to go out and actually fight, right?
Right.
So, I mean, like the fact that they aren't going to profit from it any more than, you can argue that they profit from a variety of ways. I mean, for some of them, just, getting a paycheck. I mean, like, a lot of low income people end up in the army, like in the United States, right? So just getting a regular paycheck is actually fitness benefiting, plus if you go to war and you believe that you're helping to save not only your country but your loved ones, you're defending them, right? Then in terms of inclusive fitness, that's that provides a fitness benefit, right? So I mean, just see, like the argument that it's a complex mix of motives just doesn't make sense to me. That's kind of like saying, I know this is not a perfect analogy. There's no perfect analogy. I apologize to everyone for the analogy, okay? But I mean, vaguely, it's kind of like, to have a hurricane, you've got to have a whole, actually, I don't even know it. You need to have a hurricane. I know you have to have certain conditions, right? In terms of temperature and air pressure and topography and stuff, has to come together in the right mix to give you a hurricane, right? So it's almost like saying, well, we can't really talk about hurricanes because there's just so many things that go into making them up. It's not reasonable to.
Exactly. It was almost like it was because it's hard, We shouldn't talk about it, like, oh, it's very complicated. Well, I mean, so is math, but we still do math.
Right. So there's a lot of people, a lot of people have to have a lot of buy-in has to come in for a war to happen. And people's motivation in terms of meeting their fitness interests can be quite different in terms of why they're buying in. But the fact is, if they buy in, you get the war. And then, you can say the biology, the replicators through their extended phenotype led to the war. This seems to me like a pretty straightforward position.
Absolutely. And you also don't have to be you don't have to be deterministic about it, right? Like to say that we have a biological predilection to war, perhaps. I'm not even necessarily that's what they were saying, but let's say you did. That doesn't mean that you have to go to war or that war is inevitable. It's just saying that it is a possibility. Yeah.
And in fact, I did on my own channel, because a little plug for my own channel, which I'm not really doing anymore. I've dedicated myself to this show, so I'm not even making videos. I made a video on my own channel telling everyone who subscribed there to come over here and subscribe to this show. Okay, so
thanks, Michael.
We're gonna see it's a giant leap in subscriptions, like any minute now.
Deluge.
But over there on the biological realist, I did do a little thing on war, right? And of course there's an argument that there's a biological disposition to go to war, but not at any cost, right? I mean, there's other kinds of benefits, and there's some scholarship that suggests that wealthy countries really don't go to war anymore because it's too costly to go to war. The loss in trade is too great for the benefits that come from winning the war. And so now you only see wars either between poor countries or between rich countries and poor countries, right? Yeah. So I mean, it's like it depends on what the incentives are, right? And this is a point that's going to become even more salient, actually, as we start talking about Weinstein and his interesting response to all this. So one other point I wanted to make about Dawkins, and I at one point suggested when we were first talking about putting the show together, I talked about doing a whole show on Dawkins, and I don't know, maybe we cover it here. I don't, maybe we don't have to do that, but I mean, it's just like it's both weird and sad to me.
Right. Well, I mean, I don't want to seem like we're just picking on Dawkins. I mean, I think that we both have a huge amount of respect. Like his extended phenotype book, really changed the way I thought about a lot of things. So I think that we could say that normally we're quite on side with him.
Well, okay.
Maybe not. Maybe I'm just trying to put a little bit of context that we're not.
You're more generous than me, I think. Okay, look, the Selfish Gene was one of the great books of all time, right? It was like, and Weinstein appropriately gives him full props for that in discussion.
Absolutely.
It was a game-changing book. It didn't provide that much in terms of sort of original content, but the way his ability to be able to take this body of research going back over many decades and to elegantly and eloquently summarize and explain it and provide metaphors that were inspiring to people This was just a super important book. And yes, the extended phenotype, which is kind of, I think of as part 2 of the selfish gene. Like these are like incredibly important books, but it's just like he's just in denial about his own work, and an element of that came through from, I thought, Weinstein's discussion with him. I thought that Weinstein seemed to think that at times too, but I've always thought that about him, and I think that looking back on it now, it's common for people to when reflecting on that time of the mid-70s, because if I remember correctly, I believe E.O. Wilson's book Sociobiology came out in 75, and then the Selfish Gene was 76. And people often reflect on the different fates of the two scholars, and Wilson became a lightning rod, and was attacked constantly, and deplatformed. I mean, all this deplatforming stuff you're seeing at university today, that was going on in the mid-70s too, right? And done to people like Wilson, right? And a lot of people in hindsight said, well, you know what? Dawkins was more sophisticated. He had a smarter strategy, because unlike Wilson, Wilson had this chapter at the end where he said, well, and here's how all this stuff applies to humans. And they said, well, Dawkins knew that applied to humans, but he was too smart to sort of open that can of worms. Well, I think now it's quite clear that, that Dawkins wasn't being more strategically sophisticated. He just didn't believe that this applied to humans, right?
Right, exactly. No, it is funny that to break it down and be like, all it is these replicators that are going, directionless and whatever happens to work, and then to say, but we need to rebel against them. Like he kind of pulls the philosophical underpinnings out of how everybody views the world and what sort of is a common idea, but then just stop short to be like, oh, but we need to rise above them. We need to rebel against our selfish replicators, I think was the line he used in that clip, right?
Yeah. And okay, and so we'll stop picking on Richard, because we know we'll get in trouble. I follow Dawkins on Twitter, and every once in a while when he'll say, because he comments on politics a lot, right? So every once in a while he'll make a political comment which strikes me as oddly in contrast to what would seem to be the logic of the selfish gene argument. So I'll make some little response to, and of course he never responds, but I get assaulted by all the the Dawkins it's you don't understand, whatever, right? Twitter's so much fun. So in terms then of the rebellion against our replicators, our selfish replicators. So that, I guess, then is the gist of Weinstein's response. And I had some clips of Weinstein, but I don't know if I should play them, because trying to play Dawkins clips was such a disaster. So
well, I think we can sum up, right?
Maybe that's what was said. Maybe that's a better idea. Let me just look at something here and just make sure that where it is.
I mean, one of the quotes, I'm not sure it was Weinstein or as ugly as it is, we must confront what we are programmed for if we are to resist a recurrence of those patterns in the future.
Yes. Let me just try to play one more clip and see what I say, because I think this is a good one. All right. All right, 2710. I'm sure we'll get a commercial out of all this, but anyways, I shouldn't say I'm sure, but I expect we will.
You're welcome, Pagburn philosophy.
That's right. Yeah, and we're not saying anything about Pagburn philosophy. Maybe we should say something about that, but probably not.
Thanks for.
No, that's not what I was going to say. No. All right, so let's try this clip and see what we get here. Hold on.
If I'm a robot that is programmed to be willing to put other people in a gas chamber under the right circumstances, but I as a conscious being find that idea horrifying, then I as a conscious being have to look at that program and say, under no circumstances will I be party to it. I don't care if it's fine.
Okay, so the context of that remark by Weinstein is that, he's arguing to Dawkins that we have to, unlike you, Richard, I'm saying we have to take seriously the role of the selfish gene for its extended phenotypic effects on human society and on our psychology, which gives rise to particular kind of social and historical outcomes. And he's saying that he's not only making the, I mean, I would make the argument on pure scientific grounds, right? That this is what we should be, this is the logic of the position, and this is, the way we should be thinking, and this kind of thinking should inform our hypothesis making going forward and so forth, right? But he's making a political claim here to the effect that to the degree that we recognize that that our history and society are largely a product of the programs evolved into our brain, he says it allows us then to be able to take this step back. And what was the term he used? Our conscious self or something, right? The idea of our better self. We may be prone to fall into a program or a mechanism or algorithm or module, whatever, different terms used, in evolutionary theory, to engage in genocide. But our conscious self, if we're aware of that program, can step out of the biology. Our true self, our better self, can step out of the biology and recognize this and say, I will not cross that line, right? So
I mean, I would make the argument that our conscious self makes us even better at genocide. But maybe that's too dim a view of humans.
That might be a little dim, Patricia. Yeah. A little dark. For a person in such a bright room, that's a pretty dark thought.
I know, it got really sunny in here. I'm sorry. Not used to all the sunshine in Vancouver. But yeah, no, what you're saying is true. It's like, they talk about the naturalistic fallacy a little bit, right? Just because something is good doesn't mean that that's how it ought to be. But then they also...
You mean just because something is true?
Just because something is true. I think the way they put it, like, just because something is doesn't mean it ought to be.
That's right.
Right. Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah, and of course, it's, for those who don't know, anyone watching this doesn't know natural fallacy. That's the gist of it, right? Scientists will often cite this to sort of say, look, I'm describing the way it is. I'm not saying that I think this is a good thing. I'm not saying this is the way it should be. I'm just saying this is what is true, or this is what science suggests to us must be true, right?
Exactly.
So and of course, there's the flip side of that, of course, which is sometimes called the moralistic fallacy, right? It's just because you don't like something doesn't mean it's not true, right? It cuts both ways, right? So yeah, that's fine. But but going back to this whole issue of of this conscious self, right? I mean, like this is surprisingly oblivious to the very position that Weinstein seems to be sketching out. Right now, we probably should at some episode in the future actually do something on the whole idea of the modular mind and all that sort of thing, right? But so we won't be able to go into that into nearly the kind of detail that that would be most beneficial, but it's probably worth at least sketching out the idea. And if anyone's interested in this, Robert Kurzban's book with the terrible title, Why Everyone Else is a Hypocrite.
Everyone Else is a Hypocrite.
That's right. Yeah, not a great title, but a good book. Does a good job of sort of sketching this out. Is that is that all these programs, as Weinstein calls them, are what they are neural connections that are generated genetically because through the long expanse of evolutionary time for our ancestors, they provided fast and frugal responses to survival challenges, right? So these are things that evolved because they provided fitness benefits, right? And in the case of genocide, right? Wiping out the village next door could be a fitness benefit in certain circumstances, right? So that's quite correct, right? But the problem is that it's like the feeling of being in conflict can easily be simply the tension between different programs or different modules. And the ones, an example that Kurzban uses in his book is that on the one hand, you have sort of an evolved disposition to remain fit and healthy, right? Because you're living out there on the sun. Remember, this doesn't apply to living, in North America or Europe in the, in the 21st century. This applies to, tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of years ago, right?
Right.
Living down the savannah, you had this, remain in pretty good health to be able to survive, right? So on the one hand, you have that sort of programming, but then on the other hand, you have programming for I'm hearing background noise. Is that
I
your
know.
place?
I'm sorry. Yeah, it is.
Is that your husband?
No.
Oh, no. Okay. Just annoying neighbors? Or?
No, I've got some house guests right now.
House guests. Oh, that's even worse. That's even worse. Okay. So, so on the other hand, there's the rich carbohydrates like honey were very hard to get, and so it's the hypothesis is that our ancestors who had a sweet tooth had a competitive advantage because they would take the risk and make the effort to get things like honey, which were dangerous and difficult to get, and the ones who weren't so motivated didn't get those that nutritional benefit, right? So now today we find ourselves in an environment where sweet foods are readily available. And so, the sweet tooth can be counterproductive. So for our ancestors, the sort of keep fit module and the eat sweets module were not in conflict with each other. But today they are, right? So you can have this impression that, like part of me, my sweet tooth wants to eat the sweets, but, the real me, the true me says, no, don't eat the sweet. But that's not any more true you. That's just another module evolved for fitness purposes for another reason that's in conflict. And whichever one of those happen to win in your own personal case has to do with your own genetics and the environment that you're in and all kinds of different things. But this idea that there's a part of the evolved mind that somehow is the little man inside deciding what's true and, what I should really, there's no such thing, right? There's just a conflict of different modules, right? This is the view of the modular mind. And I think this is the best view that has come out of the application of evolutionary biology to human psychology and human society. I know there's conflicting views, and maybe we'll talk about this because I know you're reading a book that gives a contrary view. But that seems to me to be a far better explanation than Weinstein's odd position that somehow we have some magical access to some Archimedean type position removed from the earth that we can sort of stand and look down upon it all and decide, oh, this is a good impulse and this is a bad impulse and I'm going to stop this one. So this is my thoughts about this. I don't know,
No, it's absolutely really well said. I think that it's like that you're going to feel conflicted about things because you've got different modules that are all running in your head at the same time. And sometimes different ones will win, but the idea that you don't have to, you're not just these different things that they touched on, like obviously like war and genocide, you do feel bad about that because there are obviously modules that have evolved, for morality to give you that feeling, but that also doesn't mean that you're not self-interested and will engage in different behaviors when a different module wins out or you've exactly in a different environment. So
yeah, and it's like so if in the situation that Brett describes, where I sort of decide not to engage in genocide, or more to the point, because this is really what we're talking about, to sit on a stage in front of hundreds of people and have a camera filming you that is going to expose you to thousands of people and say that I will not engage in genocide.
Yeah.
I mean, like that's a very particular module that's at work too, right?
Right. No, exactly.
Because I actually commented on the actual YouTube channel. I actually wrote a comment making the point that by doing this, Brett isn't avoiding his biology, he's just engaging in a kind of virtue signaling, which gives him high social status, which is a fitness benefit, right? And which is what he's doing. But of course, I got a lot of snide remarks.
But I mean, I think the fact that they're very dismissive and be like, oh, well, we've got these are relics or these are byproducts, is I don't feel like humans would still be engaging in this behavior as much as they have been in the last, few thousand years, if this was just like some leftover bit of something else that doesn't have any fitness advantage anymore. Yeah. So this was very interesting, but yeah, it just seemed to me
it seemed to me that Weinstein was it was interesting. It was interesting watching Brett's thing, right? Because I mean, because I kept cheering for him, because I was basically on his side in terms of the difference with Dawkins. I was on his side. I'm saying, yes,
Right.
good point, Brett, good point, right? And then he
Right.
would lapse into this sort of mental dualism.
I
I was like,
know.
what are you doing? What are you
I know.
doing? Why are you saying this? Doesn't make
Well,
any sense.
actually, and there was the other example that I actually wanted to talk to too, that they talked about later in the program, which was the same thing, and talked about like family planning as sort of
Oh.
stepping back from our biology, because that's like a little bit of a better or a nicer example. We can stop talking about killing people for a few minutes. But, like in family planning, it's like, it's not that you're stepping back from your biology. You have different adaptations, and you can choose different strategies for what sort of suits your situation at the time. But this idea that just because you adopt an alternate strategy, that this is no longer sort of you're acting outside your biology, I think is just incorrect.
Yeah, I mean, this is like, and it's incredible, right? This is basic sort of RK selection, life history stuff,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
I mean,
exactly.
there's different strategies, right? One strategy is let's have as many babies as possible, and we hope enough survive, right? Or the other,
Right.
we're just going to have one or two, and we're going to put all our resources into these ones, and so some people, writing about modern parenting think that this might be a problem, having
Right.
so few children. But it's a perfect in terms of replicator success. It's a perfectly good strategy, and maybe it's the better strategy. I mean, evolution will tell us in the long run whether or not it was a better strategy.
Right.
But across the animal species and across our own species, people pursue these different strategies. So yeah, I agree. Absolutely, what you're saying is right. It's another example of being weirdly, wanting to make some kind of weird claim about being able to step outside biology, when the example
Right.
is not an example of stepping outside biology. It's an example of different sort of modules or strategies coming into play.
And I mean, it's easy for us to say sort of what strategies we might personally like, or that we think other people should engage in. But I mean, the long story short is that evolution doesn't care sort of what we like and what we engage in, and we don't know what strategies are ultimately going to be successful. So you just kind of, I guess we'll see.
Yeah, I mean, like, it's not an inspiring vision, but like each
but it's
one
just
of
the
us,
reality, right?
well, each one of us is just kind of a little experiment, right?
Right.
In the grand picture of evolution, if you could think of evolution as like God, right? Evolution as a sentient thing, each one of us is a little experiment.
Right.
Let's see how this works out. We'll tweak this just a little bit and see how this turns out. Oh, that one didn't turn out. Oh, well, it's gone. Okay. But this one was very successful. And so it's spreading. So that's good, right?
Right.
So yeah, I mean, that's exactly it, right? So, and this is why I think sometimes this stuff, the naturalist of fallacy thing gets tied up in this, because it gets so easy to assume that one is dictating how how people should live their lives. And I think exactly, your point is well taken. It's not dictating how you should live your life. Live your life how you want. It's just that, at the end of the day, evolution is all the evolution cares about is replication of genes, right? And if if the way you live your life doesn't contribute to the replication of genes, then that particular strategy will become diminished in the gene pool. That's all. That's just the way it is, right?
Right.
So if you care about the replication of your genes into the future, then you should be thinking about this stuff and guiding your action by it. But if you don't care about that, then live your life how you want, I guess, right?
Oh, it's true. Yeah.
So do we want to at least briefly touch on the meme thing?
Ooh, we definitely can.
Let's okay. I'll just say a few words about it then, because I guess I don't want to get into it, too much. It's actually a really big topic.
Mm-hmm.
Dawkins from early on, I think in the second edition of the Selfish Gene, where he put in the chapter on memes. I think I can't remember now. Yeah, is that right? So yeah, basically this our argument that somehow ideas, for lack of a better word, besides meme, because ideas is a better word than memes, can sort of replicate, have replicator type aspects to them, I guess, something like that, and that's the kind of thinking, and it's a good question whether his own ideas about memes led him to his ideas about religion, or whether he was laying the seeds for his ideas about religions when he put forward the idea of memes. It's an interesting question. I wonder, in his head how it worked. But it allows for the idea then of religions as being sort of a runaway meme and even kind of a mind virus or something. I've never been sympathetic to this way of thinking. At least since I've been interested in evolutionary biology and psychology. It seems pretty evident to me, and this, I'm not going to be able to defend this here. I'm just going to say what I think, and people, if anyone watches this wants an elaboration on it, I'm happy to give it. But I tend to think that people take on the ideas that benefit their strategy, their present fitness enhancing strategies, whatever those happen to be. And that's, I think that's pretty much the argument that Weinstein made against Dawkins in that regard. And I think he was quite, he said that, meme is an extended phenotype. And I think that's precisely right. So
I get really tripped up on how you can parse a meme from an extended phenotype. And I know they had the discussion about the replicator and stuff, but and we've talked about this, you and I, Michael, before. I don't really understand exactly what a meme really is. That's the problem. There's no, at least a gene you can find little base pairs, and you're like, all right, here it is. Here's the thing that physically makes another copy of itself. And I mean, it's a nice analogy. You can apply it to other things. It's a useful concept, I guess. But in terms of invoking scientific power.
Yeah. Because it's, I mean, the meme thing is difficult because it's difficult to agree upon what a meme is. You can say, well, Christianity, you could say Christianity is a meme. But then, there's Catholics, and there's various kinds of Protestants, and there's Eastern Orthodox, they're all different memes, I guess, right? And, and within them, there's different ideas, and they're all different memes. So what is the meme exactly is not clear what the actual meme is. Now, a counter argument could say, well, genetics is complicated too, right? Because we now know there's very few things for which a single allele gives rise to a particular effect. You have plytropy and polygeneity, right? But so lots of genes are contributing to a single trait, say, sort of thing. But it's not the same because part of what we're doing now is identifying which genes. It's a whole bunch, but which genes contribute to a single trait, right? That's the replicator, right? And in fairness, Dawkins was always clear about this, right? He said the thing that replicates is what he means by gene. He doesn't mean a particular location on a chromosome, right? So. So if that's what you mean by replicate at the genetic level, yes, it's complex, but it's identifiable. You can limit it, right? Whereas when you talk about memes, you can't limit. I mean, it's just in different people's interpretation, it means different things, right?
And you can look at the chromosome and see one to the other, and you're like, that changed. Yeah. And I mean, how that change will express that, gets very complicated, but you can see identifiable differences.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And so in memes, you're saying in memes, you can't.
Yeah, well, it's just you can't even really describe what it is, and you can see changes, but I guess it's just, how are you specific and accurate when you're talking about the changes that happen in a meme?
It's literary theory.
It is, and it's a nice it is a really nice sort of example or analogy. It should be used as that and not.
Yeah.
And not hard science.
Yeah. And the example of this, we were talking about this the other day, and I gave the example of I heard Daniel Dennett give the example of how you could argue that the ships evolve because as you build ships, and if you make little changes to the ships, you send them out, and there's two possibilities: they sink or they come back, right? If they sink, then you don't do that change anymore, right? If they come back, then that's a good change and it replicates, right? So I mean, this is so then is this memes operating in ships? The fact of the matter is, human beings are building the boats because they need to sail, to discover, or to engage in trade or war or whatever, right? And so in this sense, I think that Weinstein's quite right to say that memes are just extended phenotypes. They're just an expression of the pursuit of our genetic or fitness interest. And again, I feel so bad that I ended up, feeling so against Dawkins in this thing. Because as we said off the top, I mean, he's been such an important figure. And that book, The Selfish Gene, had such a huge impact on me personally.
Yeah, exactly. So I didn't want to make it seem like we're just like tearing the guy to shreds. But I mean, I think that we did both have a lot of problems with almost everything he said.
almost everything, right?
Right.
Almost everything you said. I was going like, oh, Richard.
No, I know. And it felt very political too. Like if you want to really sort of let people know how you think about one particular idea, like religion, calling it a mind virus, even if it is a good analogy, I feel like is quite like a loaded name. Like no one likes the idea of having a mind virus. Right? So it's a little bit, it's always sort of riddled with a lot of other things.
Yeah. And that's why, and that sort of brings us back to the opening remarks about how this was a meeting or confrontation of the New Atheists and the IDW. And I think that some of the points of the applause for Dawkins were applause at the moment because the New Atheist type are really committed to their idea of a sort of autonomous rationality, a sort of a humanist autonomous rationality. And I just don't think that the biological view of human life really supports that view. We won't go into all the details of that now because
I think that sounds like another episode, Michael.
I think that is another that definitely is another episode, and we will do that episode coming up. So is that it? Have we covered anything?
I think that's it. Yeah, I hope that we did a good idea of not only saying that what we took issue with, but defending why. But sometimes I feel like I could have been a little bit more clear, but I hope that got some good points in.
All right. I think we did. And if not, maybe our 4 subscribers out there will actually let us know. All right then, Patricia.
Right. Yeah, no, thanks. It was fun, Michael.
Yeah, it was fun. Until next time.
I'll talk to you later.
Bye.
Bye.